At issue this week, former NDP leader Ed Broadbent has passed away at the age of 87. He led the party to one of their most successful campaigns in 1988, helping present the NDP as a viable option to Canadians and shaping the party for years to come.
His legacy is he never stopped. He never stopped fighting for people. Even while retired, even having started an institute, he was a big mentor to me as the 8th leader of the New Democratic Party. So he never stopped caring about people, about the movement. And that's a big part of why.
So how will Canadians remember Ed Broadbent? What is his legacy in Canadian politics and with the New Democratic Party? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down tonight. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see you all in the new year. Glad At Issue is back. So I know we've all covered Ed Broadbent and the NDP in different iterations. I'll start with you maybe, Chantal, on what you think Broadbent's long political career meant both perhaps to the country but also to the party, because it was a significant time when he was the leader of the party.
Yes, the NDP's early leaders always seemed larger than life, and maybe Ed Broadbent is the last of those who seem larger than life, in part because he took a party that was relatively young and I believe was the first NDP leader to try to open the party up to Quebec and vice versa. Yeah. And he worked really hard at it. It didn't produce the results that he would have hoped for. But in the end, I don't think the orange wave would have happened when Jack Layton led the party to a victory in Quebec if Ed Broadbent had not worked so hard at making the party more conscious about Quebec. Mm-hmm. He was also a man of the left. I remember after that orange wave in Quebec being part of a discussion where he was about how Quebecers tend to like centrist parties, and maybe that strong impetus from Quebec would bring the NDP closer to the center, and he was not comfortable with that idea. And it showed when Thomas Mulcair ran for the leadership. Ed Broadbent did not support him, and one of the reasons was that he believed that Mulcair wrongly would try to bring the NDP closer to the center.
Yeah, and he criticized him later too, and in his latest book as well, about the things that Mulcair did wrong for the NDP at the time. Andrew, in terms of the lasting effects that he had, either on the party or the country or both.
Well, I mean, he took the NDP to heights that it had not previously achieved. He went from, I think it was 17 seats before he took over as leader to 43 in the 88 election, the great free trade election. So he may not have been a man of the center, but he had some crossover appeal. He came after those great orators of Tommy Douglas and David Lewis, and he may not have had their ability to be sort of a spellbinder as a speaker, but he had a kind of a plain-spun decency, a regular Joe quality that belied the fact that he was a serious intellectual. But he could speak in a language that people could understand, could make them feel like their concerns were his concerns, in a way that people could identify with. And for the long time after he left, the party was a bit struggled. It was not able to achieve anything like the same success until, of course, the Great Orange Wave under Jack Layton. So before then, that was the high watermark with 43 seats and 20% of the popular vote. And of course, afterwards, the setting up the Broadbent Institute as a continuing legacy to carry forward some of the things that he cared about.
Yeah, Althea, how about you?
So I'm too young to have covered Ed Broadbent during the 1980s, but I did have Ed Broadbent as a professor at McGill in the early 2000s. And one of the things that I think struck me was that he was, I guess now, a deep intellectual who could verbalize for common people why he believed the ideals that he believed in. But he was also primarily a tactician when it came to politics. Like, he wasn't ready to see the NDP be the conscience of Parliament. He wanted the NDP to win. And it's rare that you have these two qualities in a politician. And frankly, I can't think of anybody in the House of Commons that fits that bill at the moment. He was also a really kind and decent person, and the kinds of attacks that we see now in the House of Commons, you never would have heard Ed Broadbent spew those words out of his mouth, but I also don't think he would have been comfortable being in a place that saw people demonize their opponents in that way. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of sad that we, I guess, are witnessing in some ways the end of an era. I hope it isn't, but it kind of feels like that today.
Yeah. Chantal?
To be fair, today's NDP in the House of Commons does not routinely engage in demonizing, but also, thinking back to Ed Broadbent, these were the days when the Conservatives and the NDP could find enough common ground that after Ed Broadbent retired, Brian Mulroney appointed him to lead a think tank. I am not sure that something like that could ever happen today with today's Conservative Party.
What about, his, you've all pointed to it, his staunch belief that the NDP had to stay on the left, and to Althea's point, yes, it was fine for it to be the conscience of Parliament, but it also had to be a potential government and able to form government. Do you think that is still where the NDP is, Andrew, or where the NDP should be, given the where things are right now?
I don't think it's where it is for certain. I think it's the days when they were dreaming of power under first Layton and then Mulcair are long past them at this point. I'm not sure they necessarily have to be. I think the lesson of the NDP's history is you can have a lot of influence and a lot of impact on Canadian politics without vying for power. That if you have a strong enough message and are prepared to put it forward with conviction, other parties will follow your lead. And I think I wish sometimes people on the right would understand that message as well.
Althea?
I think many in the NDP would like to see it challenge for power and believe it is challenging for power. It just doesn't seem that that's where most Canadians believe the NDP is. Ed Broadbent was a bit radical in his thinking. I think perhaps most Canadians believe in equality of opportunity, but I don't know that most Canadians believe in substantial equality. And that discussion is not a discussion that you actually hear very often from the NDP, even amongst the backbench, though many do believe in those ideals that Mr. Broadbent espoused. I wonder if they spoke more clearly about the vision that they have, if there would be more people that would subscribe to it, young people especially. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think there might be some thinking. Jack Layton for sure followed Mr. Broadbent's thinking, and Mr. Broadbent will probably remember, this may have been already said in the show, but he decided to back Jack Layton for the leadership of the party, even picking him over his friend Bill Blaikie, because he believed that Jack Layton had the ingredients that could lead the NDP to victory. And a lot of people initially believed that Jagmeet Singh could be that Trudeau-esque messiah to bring the NDP to the promised land. It hasn't materialized yet.
Okay, last word to you, Chantal.
Yes, but I agree with Andrew about the place of influence. I'm not sure that the dental care program that just got off the ground or the anti-strike breaker legislation, whether you like it or not, would have come to light if the NDP members in the House of Commons were just more liberals. Instead of being a different party that has some leverage on the government. But that leverage is fragile, and the party is a long, long way from when it came within sight of power after the Orange Wave.
Okay, good conversation. We will leave this part there. Still ahead, though, we'll talk about a new report from the Canadian Press that says Ottawa was warned 2 years ago that high immigration levels could affect housing costs, healthcare demands. Has the government planned well enough for increased immigration? That's next. Federal public servants reportedly warned Ottawa 2 years ago that high immigration levels could affect housing and services like healthcare. In spite of those warnings, the federal government decided to go ahead and increase the number of permanent residents to 500,000 in 2025. The Deputy Prime Minister had this to say when asked about the warning.
We are extremely fortunate as a country that we have the social capacity to welcome immigrants.
So has Ottawa missed the mark when it comes to planning for immigration? Should it have acted sooner when it comes to affordable housing? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Andrew, why don't we start with you on this? I mean, not surprising that you would have these huge immigration goals, and that then you would then be challenged with how the system was going to support these people, whether it be the social safety net or affordable housing. A little curious that there was apparently sort of red flags put up to the government and they forged ahead. What do you make of the fact that they stuck with their immigration plans and maybe didn't consider all the fallout or consequences of that?
Well, there's two elements. There's the planned part and there's the apparently unplanned part. So the permanent resident numbers are higher than we've known in the past, but not hugely so. I think the more problematic stuff is the temporary residents that have been at numbers that I'm not sure the government ever anticipated. But that being said, yeah, there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with having higher levels of immigration if you also are taking care of the supply side of the equation. If you're talking about, if you're going to have that much labor supply coming in, you better have higher levels of investment than we've had. If you're going to have that much demand for housing, you better have much higher supply of housing than we've had in the recent past. The two things go together, and I guess my problem is not so much that they've let that level of immigration in, but it's exposed the damage of our bad housing policies and bad investment policies. If we had housing at levels that we had in the 1970s, and it continued that, if we hadn't tied the housing market up in knots all those years, we wouldn't be having a housing shortage even with these levels of immigration. If we had more pro-investment policies so that we didn't have the kind of slump in investment that we've had for the last 20 or 30 years, then we could handle that on the labor market side as well in terms of productivity. So it's the failure to enact these other policies that I'm concerned about more than the immigration level itself.
Chantal, you want in there?
Still, the federal government has to make decisions in real time. And in real time, the housing shortage had materialized. The investment deficit was a reality. And you're basically saying, we're going to bring people in and then things will happen. And that goes, it's not just housing, it's a demand for healthcare, demand for daycare. Go down the list. And at some point, it points to a feature of this government. It is good at announcing measures. It is less good at delivering what needs to be done to take into account the consequences of its decisions. And on this, you find that they have the machinery, the civil service machinery, to know what to expect. This isn't, oh, how could we have seen this coming? It's not a pandemic. It's a government decision. The problem is that the federal government's main job is macro policy. This is macro policy. We're going to let in more people. We have a problem with housing. Should we reconsider? And I agree with Andrew. It's not the decision to have more immigrants. No. It's if you're going to bring people in, can we somehow make sure that it's possible that they have a roof over their heads?
Yeah, because the problem is that immigration was needed, right, for all the reasons that we know, for the labor market, for economic growth, for all those different things. It's just that these other things that you're talking about didn't happen at the same time. So how do you think the government is managing this, Althea?
Well, actually, I worry that Ms. Phelan is wrong, that we don't have the social capacity to accept more immigrants. So far, and I think we've been lucky in this country, we haven't had a very politicized debate over immigration. But it's not just, quote unquote, racists who are going to start asking questions about immigration levels. Yep. It's not just about the temporary foreign workers that have come in at the request of private employers. It's the foreign students that we have accepted that have also put pressure on the housing market. It's the increased levels. It's trying to find a doctor waiting 23 hours at the emergency room because there's no capacity. And all of this is, is aggravated because we have a federal system where a lot of the power to address some of these issues lies with the provinces. But when you don't have, enough people in settlement services to accept people as well, it's not just the Canadians who are here who are going to start to wonder, how can we absorb more immigrants? It's new immigrants who arrive here who may feel, quite rightly, I would think, that what they were promised or what they expected is not going to deliver, because it's much harder to get their foot in the door, to get a good job, to find a home they can afford. And so that kind of social contract that we have, or that social capacity that Ms. Freeland talks about, I think it's at risk. And I hope that we don't see politicians exploiting it, but I do think it's a sleeper issue.
I should say,
Andrew and then Chantal. Yep.
Yeah, I've been encouraged, nevertheless, by the absence of a backlash. We're having, at this point, maybe things will change, but at this point, a relatively civilized discussion about should we throttle back a little bit, should we do this, do that. I haven't seen much in the way of really intolerant sentiment, except on the fringes, but I don't think it's gone beyond that at this point. It's much better than it would have been 40, 50 years ago. And I think that's a testament to the fact that we've had sustained immigration over many years. And so, where you find the most intolerance of immigration is when there are places where there isn't very many immigrants. We're in a society now where we're approaching, not far off, where 50% of the population will either be immigrants or the children of immigrants. I think it's harder to gin up a backlash in that kind of society than in a society that's not used to immigration and doesn't have many immigrants in it.
Chantal?
I believe that in the past, the backlashes on immigration were more related to a labor market that featured high unemployment, which has not been the case and is not to this day the case. We're dealing with labor shortages. I do believe there's a backlash. It's not against immigrants, but it is part and parcel of the polls we're seeing about the Liberals, looking at their re-election chances going down the drain. People are, at this point, pointing the finger at the federal government and at governments in general for what they see as the housing affordability issue. And when you look at warnings that are ignored and light statements that we have the social capacity to do this, you kind of think the fingers are being pointed in the right direction.
30 seconds to you, Althea.
I just want to clarify, I don't think it's going to be a backlash against immigrants in the sign of like the racist tone or the anti-Muslim sentiment that we saw very early in Quebec. I think what it is going to be is a challenge to having more and more immigrants come here without having the policies in place. Because as Chantal mentioned, the government is really good at making announcements. And back in 2015, you could argue that in part they won their election because they embraced, more Syrian refugees. Yep. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. But that, those promises also come with responsibilities. And I think the public is realizing now that the government didn't actually engage in all the responsibilities it should have taken to make that contract something that was fair for everybody.
We have to take a short break, but when we return, we'll talk about Saskatchewan's decision to stop collecting the carbon tax on natural gas, what it means for relations between Ottawa and the provinces. That's next.
You can call it a pressure tactic if you want. What this is going to do is provide immediate relief for people on their natural gas bills and their power bills come January 1st. That relief is being provided, whether or not the federal government will essentially recognize that.
That was Saskatchewan's Dustin Duncan discussing his province's decision to stop collecting the carbon tax on natural gas as of January 1st. The decision was made in protest to Ottawa's exemption for home heating oil. So what's to be made of this impending legal showdown between Ottawa and Saskatchewan? What does it tell us about the relationship with the provinces? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea. Obviously, we've talked about this many times. But Saskatchewan followed through, and now we're waiting, I guess, to see whether they are going to remit to Ottawa the amount. They also have some strange ideas that they're still going to get the rebate. I don't understand how that works. But Althea, do you think that they're going to follow through on this in terms of what they give back to Ottawa, or do you think that this is it? This is just sort of posturing?
You mean, do I think that the Saskatchewan government is going to give the levy to the government?
Yes.
I guess it depends on whether or not CRA decides. I mean, I feel like we're getting really into the weeds, but whether or not CRA decides to agree to replace the energy company as the distributor and instead pick the government of Saskatchewan, which I don't see why they would be incentivized to do. So then the question is, if Ottawa doesn't do that, also they don't have a good relationship with the government of Saskatchewan. Does Saskatchewan decide to just use its own general revenue to pay for the levy, which is a lot of money, so that its residents can get the rebate from the federal government? The irony in all this is that we're probably going to learn more about the fact that there is a rebate from Saskatchewan's actions than anything the Liberals have done in the last few years to talk about this rebate. So that's interesting. The other thing is the rebate isn't as, how to put this, as clear as you might expect. One would think they collect all this money and they give 90% of it back to the province and everybody gets a big fat check. Except that in years where they undercounted or overcounted, the rebate then therefore adjusts for the following year. So, in Atlantic Canada, for example, you would think that they would have a lower rebate, but they may not necessarily have a lower rebate if the math didn't work out in the last calendar year. So it's all very complicated, and I think just brings back to the fact that the Saskatchewan government made an announcement for communications reasons without really thinking of the political implications of what this would mean, and is now having to adjust, and this policy may make zero sense at the end of the day.
That was in the weeds, but like very welcome context. I'll say that. Chantal and then Andrew.
I don't think they're going to come to this realization that it doesn't make much sense at the end of the day. I think that's already apparent. If you're not paying the carbon tax, you're not getting a rebate. Whether you get the rebate now for last year, at some point you're not going to be getting money for the money you saved.
That's right.
It all works out. But there is a principle involved here. And it is that if, and the courts will probably have a say on that, but if, as most experts believe, this is illegal on the part of Saskatchewan's
they've acknowledged
government.
it. The Premier has acknowledged it.
So on that basis, I can't think of a federal government that can afford to allow provinces to pick and choose what federal statutes or what federal obligations they will fulfill legally, because they decide that that's not something they're going to do. They're not interested anymore. How about not collecting the GST in Alberta if you're going to go there?
Yeah. Well, and I know Andrew has about 20 minutes of response here, but then why would Ottawa do other things? Why would it send the full healthcare transfer to Saskatchewan? Like, we can go on like this forever, back and forth. Andrew, last word to you on this.
Well, fortunately, the government of Saskatchewan does not appear to have thought this through very well. They do have the look of the dog that's been chasing the car and then does not know what to do when it's caught it. They certainly don't want to expose the executives at Sask Energy to legal consequences. I think they thought they could pull this switcheroo, where they'd insert themselves in the law rather than the Sask Energy as the distributor, but you can't. It's in the federal law. You have to actually be in the distribution business. You can't just say you are. So that's not going to work. So now you're seeing them saying, well, actually, okay, we're not going to collect the tax, but we are going to remit it, and that's the part that's required by law. So they're talking about basically spending, I think it's $200 or $300 million for what purpose? So they could send the money to Ottawa, the money Ottawa is going to get anyway, and maybe look like heroes to their own electorate, but more looking kind of more foolish by the day, frankly. So no, I don't anticipate the feds are going to yield to this. They certainly shouldn't, and I would actually expect, I think Saskatchewan's going to find a way to climb down on this.
Well, I don't know why people in Saskatchewan would be supportive of using general revenues to pay Ottawa for this, because that's like less money on roads, less money on hospitals, less money on education.
Okay, I got to leave it there.
Except you only see the less money after the provincial election.
That is very true. That is very true.
I promise we'll talk about this again. I 100% guarantee we'll talk about it again. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.